You know him as Lucas McCain, the sharp-shooting, justice-loving hero from The Rifleman. But who was Chuck Connors when the cameras stopped rolling? Was he just the cowboy we saw on screen? Or was there much more beneath the surface? From professional athlete to Hollywood icon, and from secret heartbreaks to political connections, Chuck Connors led a life as gripping as any Western tale. What secrets did he carry? And how did his real story reshape the legend we thought we knew? Humble beginnings in the shadows of hardship, before the world came to know the steely gaze of Lucas McCain or the confident rifle spin that became an icon of American television, there was simply Kevin Joseph Aloysius Connors, a lanky, introspective boy navigating the worn-out streets of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, during one of the harshest economic periods in American history. Born on April 10, 1921, to Irish immigrants Alan and Marcella Connors, Chuck was brought into a world that offered little security and demanded everything from the working class. The Great Depression wasn't just a chapter in a textbook for the Connors family. It was a daily struggle marked by hunger, uncertainty, and a determined resilience that left its imprint on the boy who would grow into a symbol of endurance. His father, a longshoreman, labored on the freezing docks of New York's harbor, breaking his back for modest pay and enduring long hours of unforgiving physical toil. His mother took whatever work she could find: laundry, cleaning, small clerical jobs, stretching every dollar like taffy just to keep food on the table. Home was a small apartment where heat was a luxury, shoes were patched and repatched, and the warmth of family replaced the warmth they couldn't afford. In a rare 1975 interview, Chuck recalled those days with quiet honesty. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. Somehow, that was enough." It wasn't nostalgia, it was survival, and the kind that shaped his spine. That tiny Brooklyn apartment was filled with worry and wear, but also love. Hope didn't arrive in grand moments, it flickered in small victories: a warm meal, a shared laugh, or a used glove passed down from another neighborhood kid. Refuge in motion. Sports as a lifeline. From a young age, Chuck found peace, not in stillness, but in motion. The cracked sidewalks of Bay Ridge became his training ground. He would dribble a ball through alleyways, race neighborhood kids up and down side streets, and swing makeshift bats at rubber balls wrapped in tape. He wasn't just playing, he was fleeing from poverty, from powerlessness, and from the gnawing fear that this might be all there ever was. Every movement was a small rebellion against his circumstances. At just 14 years old, Connors' raw athleticism caught the eye of a local scout who offered him a scholarship to Adelphi Academy, a prestigious private school in Brooklyn. The sudden shift was jarring. Surrounded by wealth and comfort foreign to him, Chuck felt like an outsider. "I never felt like I belonged," he later admitted, "but I knew I had to make it count." He made it count. He didn't just participate in sports, he dominated them. Baseball, basketball, football, track. Chuck played them all. His tireless spirit turned every practice into a step away from hunger, and every game into a new page in his escape story. But despite his rising star, the weight of his background never left him. In a reflective 1981 interview, he admitted, "Sometimes I'd sit alone after practice, just thinking how lucky I was, and how scared I was to lose it." That blend of gratitude and fear became his fuel. It gave him the fire that would later define his most famous character, Lucas McCain, a man of few words and deep scars. The college years, finding identity through grit. By the time he reached Seton Hall University in the early 1940s, Chuck was no longer a struggling boy from Bay Ridge. He was a respected dual-sport athlete, standing tall at 6 feet 5 inches, exuding quiet confidence and determination. He played both basketball and baseball at Seton Hall, gaining attention from professional scouts. His teammates affectionately gave him the nickname Chuck, taken from his signature phrase on the basketball court, "Chuck it to me." But beneath the smiles and high fives was still a boy carrying his past like an old wound. His family still struggled. The distance between who he was and where he came from only widened. He was winning on the surface, but deep down, he still feared it would all come undone. And, in many ways, it did. Dreams deferred, a star without a stage. In 1946, Chuck Connors joined the Boston Celtics during their inaugural NBA season. Tall and imposing, he became the first NBA player to shatter a backboard during a game, an accidental but historic moment. Yet despite his size and intensity, he played just 49 games, averaging 4.5 points per game. The dream was real, but short-lived. Less than a year later, he left professional basketball. His eyes turned back to baseball, the game he believed still held promise. On May 1, 1949, Chuck made his MLB debut with his hometown Brooklyn Dodgers, a boyhood dream realized. He played one game, hit into a double play, and was quickly demoted. "That day stayed with me for years," he later said. "I thought that was it, that I'd blown everything." But giving up wasn't in his nature. Chuck continued grinding through the minor leagues, from the Montreal Royals to the Los Angeles Angels, refusing to let go. In 1951, he got another shot, this time with the Chicago Cubs. Over 66 games, he hit 2 home runs and posted a .239 batting average. It wasn't enough for stardom, but it was a testament to his resolve. Every swing was an act of defiance against the voice whispering he wasn't good enough. A chance swing, Hollywood comes calling. Then, as fate would have it, a single home run in a 1952 minor league game changed everything. In the stands that day was Billy Gordon, a casting director from MGM. He wasn't there for scouting, but when he saw Chuck's commanding presence, he leaned to a colleague and said, "That's the Laurence Olivier of the Diamond." After the game, Gordon approached him in the locker room and asked, "You ever think about acting?" Chuck hadn't. But a minor injury gave him just enough downtime to walk into MGM studios for a screen test. The camera rolled, and the athlete became an actor. The focus, the presence, the internal fire, it all translated effortlessly to film. Within 3 days, Chuck Connors signed his first Hollywood contract. "It felt like I'd finally been seen," he said in a 1964 interview. His first role was small, a police captain in Pat and Mike, with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. But Tracy saw something in him and told him, "Stick with it. You've got something." That sentence lit a fire no game ever had. Building a new identity, from extra to leading man. Chuck threw himself into acting with the same discipline that had carried him through sports. Over the next few years, he took every role, from background parts to minor leads. He brought a natural, quiet intensity, his performances often tinged with vulnerability and strength. In 1957, his appearance in Disney's Old Yeller marked a turning point. Playing Bernie Sanderson, a firm but loving father, Connors struck a chord. The right people noticed, specifically the producers of a new television western. They were looking for someone who could carry both the strength and grief of a widowed rancher raising his son in the Old West. After watching Old Yeller, they knew Chuck Connors was their man. Becoming Lucas McCain. A Western icon is born. In 1958, Chuck Connors stood under the blazing Arizona sun to film the first episode of The Rifleman. The role of Lucas McCain wasn't just another part. It was the culmination of everything he had lived. but the offer had come with uncertainty. The salary was lower than previous jobs. Still, MGM sweetened the deal with a 5% share of the show's profits, a rare, risky move that showed they believed in him. Chuck believed, too. He said yes, knowing this might be the last chance to do something that truly mattered. He trained exhaustively, working with Rod Redwing, a firearms expert, to perfect the spinning of his modified Winchester rifle. He practiced horseback riding until his legs ached. Every blistered palm and sore muscle became part of the character. The truth of Lucas, Chuck once said, was in the silence. He didn't have to say much. He'd lived it. And America listened. Legacy and grit and grace. The Rifleman ran from 1958 to 1963, delivering 168 episodes of storytelling that blended action, morality, and emotional weight. McCain wasn't just a tough cowboy. He was a father, a widower, a man scarred by loss, yet unwilling to surrender to it. Millions of viewers connected with that strength, the kind born from real struggle. Chuck Connors wasn't acting. He was channeling a life of endurance. Baseball taught me how to lose, he later reflected. Acting taught me how to stay standing. He became a television legend not by pretending to be something he wasn't, but by letting the audience see what he had always been. A kid from Brooklyn who had nothing. A man who gave everything. A voice for those who grew up unseen. A blessing buried in bruises. In a rare and candid 1965 interview, Chuck Connors, the towering actor best known for playing Lucas McCain in The Rifleman, reflected on the profound complexity of his most famous role. "It was a blessing buried in bruises," he said, his deep voice tinged with both pride and weariness. That single phrase carried a lifetime of meaning. To Connors, McCain was more than a character. He was a reflection, a mirror of hope and heartbreak, sacrifice and steadfastness. There was pride in his voice, but it was laced with something deeper, a quiet resignation, as though the role had etched itself onto his soul and never quite let go. The premiere of a cultural milestone. When The Rifleman first aired on September 30th, 1958, families across America gathered in their living rooms to watch something that would soon transcend television. It wasn't just another Western in a sea of shoot-'em-ups. It was a father-son story wrapped in grit, grief, and quiet love. Set against the harsh backdrop of the New Mexico Territory in the 1880s, the show followed widowed rancher Lucas McCain as he raised his young son, Mark, alone. But more than a frontier drama, The Rifleman became a cultural milestone, redefining masculinity and parental love for a generation. A father's soul on screen. Lucas McCain quickly became a symbol of unwavering moral clarity and paternal devotion. With his Winchester rifle and soft-spoken wisdom, McCain wasn't just a Western hero. He was a surrogate father to millions. Viewers, many of them dealing with personal losses or fractured families, found solace and guidance in the character's strength. Letters poured into the studio from single fathers who saw themselves in McCain, from Vietnam veterans longing for justice and stability, and from teenagers wrestling with broken homes and absent parents. One letter, from a man in Idaho, read, "Watching Lucas has given me an anchor when I had none. Thank you, Mr. Connors, for showing me what love really looks like." Success and sacrifice. By the end of its first season, The Rifleman had become the fourth highest-rated show in the country, drawing over 14 million households on opening night alone. But for Chuck Connors, success came with a steep and silent price. The character of Lucas McCain, with his crisp hat, moral compass, and steady rifle, became so iconic that it began to eclipse the man who played him. Connors found that the public could no longer separate him from his role. In a deeply personal letter to a friend dated 1961, he wrote, "I haven't looked in a mirror and seen Chuck in a long time. I see Lucas, and sometimes I wonder who's left inside." A creative force beyond the camera. Chuck Connors was not just the face of the Rifleman, he was one of its creative engines. As a story consultant, he was intimately involved in shaping the narrative and ensuring authenticity. He regularly rewrote dialogue so Lucas would sound like a real working rancher. He also invited former teammates, like baseball legend Duke Snider, to guest star, further grounding the show in reality. More than that, Connors mentored young actors, including a then-rising Dennis Hopper, encouraging them to dig beneath the surface and find the man beneath the hat. Yet this devotion, so celebrated on screen, began to isolate Connors in his real life. Directors and casting agents came to see only Lucas McCain. Any trace of his native New York accent or his tough guy persona outside the Western mold threatened the illusion he had so carefully built. Offers for roles outside the genre dwindled. He found himself rejecting scripts, not because he didn't want to take them, but because Hollywood couldn't see beyond the rifle and the ranch. Caught in his own making. By the final season in 1963, The Rifleman had aired 168 episodes, many of them emotionally charged standoffs between Lucas and his son. Connors, despite the fame, was trapped in a character of his own making. He had created a hero so vivid, so admired, that escaping him became nearly impossible. And yet, Connors never disrespected the role. He wore it with a quiet dignity. During the filming of one particularly emotional episode, Connors spent an entire afternoon rehearsing a scene in which Lucas teaches young Mark to face his fears. Crew members recalled how tears welled up in Chuck's eyes when the director finally yelled, "Cut." In that moment, he wasn't acting. He was that father. That scene remains etched in the memories of fans as one of the most honest portrayals of fatherhood ever broadcast on American television. Redefining masculinity on the frontier. The Rifleman didn't just change households, it transformed television. At a time when masculinity was often painted with broad strokes of stoicism and aggression, Lucas McCain introduced a different kind of strength. Here was a man who wielded a gun, yes, but never to bully, only to defend what was right. He was unafraid to show tenderness, to admit grief, to parent with compassion rather than control. This was a seismic shift in how male heroes were depicted. And it resonated. Chuck Connors became the face of this new frontier masculinity. Resilient, but tender. Tough, yet emotionally available. It was a role that changed lives, and changed him. The father behind the camera. The impact of Chuck Connors' fatherly presence extended far beyond the script. One of the most profound relationships to emerge from the series was between Connors and Johnny Crawford, the young actor who played Mark McCain. What began as a casting choice evolved into a deep, lifelong bond that endured long after the cameras stopped rolling. He wasn't just a co-star, Johnny would later say, choking back tears at Chuck's funeral in 1992. He was a real father to me. More than a mentor, from the very first day on set in 1958, Connors took Johnny under his wing. Their off-camera relationship mirrored the father-son dynamic they portrayed on screen. On weekends, Connors would take Johnny camping. They sat around fires, shared stories, and talked about everything from sports to life's deeper questions. Connors taught him how to fish, how to saddle a horse properly, and more importantly, how to carry oneself with humility and integrity. This wasn't staged. There were no press releases or photo ops. It was genuine affection. Connors, who had once dreamed of a career in professional sports before turning to acting, found a kind of redemption in mentoring Johnny. In giving guidance, he reclaimed something he'd lost, a purpose beyond fame. Reflections in every scene. As the series progressed, the emotional depth between Lucas and Mark deepened. Their scenes together, glances full of meaning, firm but gentle guidance, moments of vulnerability, were not just acts. They were rooted in real emotion. Many crew members commented on how Connors visibly softened around Johnny. "It was like watching a real father and son," one cameraman said. And in many ways, it was. Their bond was most evident in later years, long after the show's final curtain call. When Chuck passed away in 1992, it was Johnny who delivered the most heartfelt eulogy. A tearful goodbye. At the memorial service, Johnny stood before a crowd of mourners, barely able to hold himself together. He was more than Lucas McCain," he said, his voice cracking. "He was the man who made me feel safe when I was scared. He was there when I lost my first pet. He cheered for me louder than anyone when I graduated high school. I didn't just lose a friend. I lost a father. There was no script, no pretense. Just love, raw, painful, and irreplaceable. A legacy that lives on The Rifleman was more than a television show. It was a national mirror. In Lucas McCain, Chuck Connors offered America not just entertainment, but hope. He showed a generation of men that strength didn't mean silence, that love could be fierce and gentle at once, that being a father wasn't about dominance, but devotion. Connors once wrote in a 1964 letter, "I've given my strength to Lucas, and sometimes I feel empty at home. His life and mine are tangled beyond repair." In the end, it wasn't fame that wore him down, but the emotional toll of living as a symbol while feeling unseen as a man. Still, he never turned his back on what the role meant. Even as Hollywood moved on and his career hit fences too high to cross, he bore the weight of Lucas McCain with quiet honor. When the final episode aired in 1963, there was no grand send-off, just the fading echo of a rifle shot and a prairie wind that seemed to whisper goodbye. Millions felt the loss, but couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps because they weren't just saying farewell to a character. They were letting go of a father they never truly knew they needed. Chuck Connors gave the world more than a hero. He gave them a man, flawed, devoted, and real. And in doing so, he left behind not just a show, but a legacy of love carved into the heart of American television. A bond beyond the screen. Chuck Connors and Johnny Crawford. In a town where relationships often flicker and fade like dying marquee lights, the connection between Chuck Connors and Johnny Crawford stood as a rare beacon of sincerity. Their relationship wasn't built on the fleeting contracts of Hollywood, nor on the inflated glamour of red carpet appearances. Instead, it thrived in the quiet moments, shared meals between scenes, heartfelt advice whispered over coffee, and an unspoken understanding that transcended scripts and camera angles. Chuck Connors, who famously played Lucas McCain on The Rifleman, wasn't just portraying America's favorite dad. To Johnny Crawford, who played his son Mark on the show, Connors lived that role in the most personal, enduring way. Johnny was only 12 years old when he stepped into the role that would define his career. On and off camera, Chuck took it upon himself to become a mentor, protector, and surrogate father to the young actor. Colleagues often noted how Chuck would adjust his schedule to make sure Johnny got enough rest, or how he'd sit with him between takes to go over lines, not out of obligation, but with the patience and warmth of someone who genuinely cared. In a business where young actors were often treated as props or accessories, Johnny found in Chuck a rare advocate. This bond was not publicized or manufactured for media clout. It simply existed, quietly, steadfastly, and profoundly. Their relationship extended far beyond the show's run. Even decades after The Rifleman ended, Chuck remained close to Johnny, attending his concerts, supporting his career, and keeping in touch through handwritten notes and phone calls. When Johnny began to struggle with health issues later in life, Chuck's care and concern for him remained evident. This enduring connection added a quiet but powerful dimension to Connors's legacy. No award, fan letter, or critical acclaim could compare to the emotional weight of this authentic, deeply human relationship. For fans who still rewatch The Rifleman late at night, it's this invisible thread between fiction and truth, between Lucas McCain and Chuck Connors, that makes the story endure and makes hearts ache just a little more. The price of a role, typecasting, and the cage of fame. As the applause for The Rifleman faded and the cameras stopped rolling, Chuck Connors found himself battling a new and unexpected opponent, one not written into any script, but equally relentless. The very role that had catapulted him into American living rooms night after night became the invisible cage that confined him. Over 168 episodes, Connors had become Lucas McCain in the minds of millions. The character's strength, integrity, and moral clarity became indistinguishable from the actor himself. And therein lay the paradox: to be loved so deeply for one role that every other part of your artistic self becomes eclipsed by it. In the years immediately following The Rifleman, Chuck was inundated with offers, but they were all the same. More cowboys, more sheriffs, more rugged frontier heroes. He turned down 8 Western television pilots in just the first 2 years after the show ended. "I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in a saddle," he once said, half joking, but clearly weighed down by the truth behind the quip. Breaking free from the shadow of Lucas McCain was not just about finding new roles. It was about reclaiming his identity as a serious, versatile actor. Connors did try to redefine himself. In Branded, 1965–66, he played Jason McCord, a disgraced cavalry officer trying to clear his name. It was a layered, complex role that challenged the very archetypes he'd previously embodied. The show had promise and even a devoted fan base, but it failed to achieve the same cultural resonance as The Rifleman. Then came one of the most jarring transformations of his career: the role of a brutal slave owner in the groundbreaking miniseries Roots, 1977. Here, Connors deliberately took on a part that would force viewers to confront their preconceptions. His performance was chilling and unflinching, a complete departure from the moral uprightness of Lucas McCain. It earned him an Emmy nomination, but also created discomfort. Many fans found it hard to reconcile the beloved television father with the cruel character he portrayed. The ghost of McCain loomed large, even in science fiction films like Soylent Green, where Connors co-starred with Charlton Heston. Hollywood insiders began to whisper, "Too Western, too McCain." This professional pigeonholing began to take a toll on Connors. Behind his steel-blue eyes was a growing self-doubt. In a 1979 interview, he confessed, "Sometimes I wonder if Lucas was a blessing or a curse. He gave me everything but took away so much." That level of emotional honesty revealed a man grappling with the duality of success, the joy of recognition and the pain of creative confinement. For Chuck Connors, being America's favorite father was both an honor and a burden. And it was a burden he carried with stoic dignity, even as it slowly frayed the edges of his identity. Behind the curtain, the turbulent private life of Chuck Connors. While Lucas McCain stood tall as the paragon of fatherly virtue and emotional steadiness, the man who played him was grappling with a far more turbulent and complicated personal life. Chuck Connors wasn't just a television icon, he was a man who carried the emotional wreckage of 3 broken marriages and a string of fractured relationships, each one peeling back a layer of the carefully curated image he presented to the world. His first marriage to Elizabeth Rendell began in 1948 during his minor league baseball years in Canada. For a while, they seemed like the embodiment of the post-war American dream. Together, they had 4 sons. There are still surviving black-and-white photographs of their early years, picnics in the park, family trips to the ballpark, and warm holiday scenes that could have come straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. But behind the smiles, a quieter drama was unfolding. Chuck's compulsive infidelity had already begun to erode their family life. Hollywood insiders spoke in hushed tones about his flirtations with co-stars, his secretive late-night outings, and phone calls that Elizabeth pretended not to hear. "I was married to the character he played, not the man he became," she allegedly confided to a friend in the early 60s. By 1962, their marriage had crumbled under the weight of emotional betrayal. Just a year later, Chuck remarried, this time to Kamala Devi, an Indian actress he met on the set of Geronimo. Their union shocked Hollywood, not just because it was interracial during a time of intense racial tension in America, but also because it seemed to mark a radical shift in Chuck's life narrative. For a time, the two made headlines as a glamorous, exotic couple. But beneath the glossy photographs and public appearances, the relationship was fracturing. Friends described their dynamic as mercurial, veering from passionate devotion to stony silence. Rumors of physical altercations, emotional manipulation, and growing emotional distance began to circulate. Kamala's friends later said she often felt like a character in Chuck's public story, rather than a real partner in his private life. After their divorce in 1972, Chuck drifted into bachelorhood, only to marry again in 1977. His third wife, Faith Quabius, a former Playboy bunny more than 30 years his junior, marked perhaps the most controversial chapter of his romantic life. Even in a permissive town like Hollywood, their age difference raised eyebrows. The couple lived extravagantly, but friends noticed something unsettling. Chuck's charm often masked a growing volatility. His disregard for personal boundaries, his flashes of temper, and a subtle but growing sense of unease began to shadow their relationship. The marriage collapsed in less than 3 years, amid whispered accusations of psychological manipulation, erratic behavior, and threats behind closed doors. The real father figure? Strained bonds and emotional distance. Chuck Connors' on-screen persona, as Lucas McCain, made him a beloved symbol of American fatherhood. But the contrast between the man and the myth was stark, especially for his own children. One of his sons later reflected, "People saw him as this incredible father figure, but we knew him as someone who chased roles more than birthdays, who kissed fans more than he hugged us." The damage ran deep. Chuck missed graduations, holidays, even hospital stays. The warmth he displayed toward Johnny Crawford, a young actor he had no biological tie to, was rarely seen in his private family life. Estrangement became the norm, rather than the exception. One son reportedly stopped speaking to him for years. The emotional cost of fame, and perhaps more crucially, the cost of playing a mythologized version of oneself, became painfully evident in Chuck's personal life. Friends noted this emotional dichotomy. On set, he could light up a room with charisma and strength. Off set, he seemed haunted, preoccupied, and emotionally walled off. He was two people, one director recalled. The man who made America cry every Thursday night, and the man who cried alone in his trailer. Some of his female co-stars also began to grow wary. Several declined to work with him again, citing behavior that ranged from uncomfortable flirtation to more serious emotional manipulation. These were whispers in the shadows of his fame, rarely reaching the public, but quietly tarnishing his reputation within the industry. The very traits that made Lucas McCain an icon, his strength, his intensity, his moral clarity, when blurred with Connor's own impulses, became tools for control rather than protection. Legacy and reflection. The man behind the legend. As time passed and the golden age of westerns faded into television history, Chuck Connors's place in popular culture remained secure. Reruns of The Rifleman continued to air, introducing new generations to Lucas McCain's stoic heroism. But for those who looked closer, who read between the scenes and beyond the roles, a more complex portrait emerged. Chuck Connors was a man of contradictions, fiercely loyal and emotionally distant, professionally disciplined yet personally chaotic. A surrogate father to one child actor and a virtual stranger to his own sons. He was someone who carried the weight of his own myth, sometimes proudly, sometimes reluctantly, and often with a quiet ache that never fully went away. His legacy, therefore, is not just in the roles he played, but in the human moments he shared, and the ones he failed to. In the bond he formed with Johnny Crawford, in the courage he showed in roles that defied his typecast, and in the battles he fought behind the scenes that the world rarely saw. For all his flaws and failings, Chuck Connors remains a figure worthy of reflection, not just as Lucas McCain, but as a man who dared to live in the complicated space between the person he was and the legend he became. A towering presence on screen and off. In the golden age of American television, few figures loomed larger than Chuck Connors. Standing at 6 feet 6 inches with piercing eyes, chiseled features, and a commanding presence, he wasn't just a star, he was a symbol. As Lucas McCain, the sharpshooting, widowed father in The Rifleman, Connors embodied an idealized vision of American masculinity. Strong, principled, and protective. He was the man every boy wanted to grow up to be, and every girl felt safe around. To the American public, he was more than just an actor. He was a moral compass in a turbulent era. But behind the stoic glare and television charisma, Connors was a man of striking contradictions. While his public persona represented steadiness and integrity, those closest to him, family, colleagues, and longtime friends, saw a far more complicated figure. One riddled with emotional distance, unpredictable moods, and a deep discomfort with vulnerability. In life, Chuck Connors captivated millions, but in death, the deeper truths of his story began to surface. The rise of a multi-talented star, born Kevin Joseph Aloysius Connors on April 10, 1921, in Brooklyn, New York, Chuck came from modest beginnings. The son of Irish immigrants, he was raised in a devout Catholic household during the Great Depression. Like many children of his generation, hardship shaped him early. But Connors was gifted, not just physically, but intellectually. He excelled at sports, playing both basketball and baseball at high levels. He even made it to Major League Baseball, playing briefly for the Brooklyn Dodgers and later the Chicago Cubs. This rare blend of athleticism and charisma caught the eye of Hollywood. Transitioning into acting in the early 1950s, Connors brought to the screen the same intensity and discipline that had made him successful on the field. In 1958, he landed the role that would define his career, Lucas McCain in The Rifleman. The show, centered around a widowed father raising his son in the rugged American frontier, became an instant hit and ran for 5 successful seasons. Its themes of justice, sacrifice, and parental love struck a deep chord with audiences. Lucas McCain wasn't just a character. He was an emblem of American values in a rapidly changing society. Charisma with a darker edge. To fans, Chuck Connors was a man of principle. But privately, a different image took shape, one that was more elusive and, at times, unsettling. While there was never any formal scandal attached to his name during his lifetime, those in Hollywood's inner circles spoke in hushed tones of his mercurial behavior. Friends and co-workers described a man who could be intensely charming one moment and coldly dismissive the next. This duality was particularly apparent in his relationships with women. While Connors was known for his flirtatious nature and magnetic presence, several of his female co-stars declined future work with him. Their reasons, while never made official, often centered around his failure to respect boundaries. Some described suggestive conversations that crossed lines of professionalism, while others noted his discomfort when his advances were rebuffed. One actress, who remained anonymous, described Connors as a gentleman on screen, but off-camera, you weren't always sure which version of him you were going to get. While these accounts never escalated into public accusations, they reveal a troubling dynamic. A man whose on-screen warmth didn't always extend to his off-screen conduct. Connors had perfected the role of protector and father figure so well that few questioned the inconsistencies beneath the surface. Fame offered a shield, and for decades, few dared to lift it. The burden of being Lucas McCain. Perhaps the greatest irony of Chuck Connors' life was that the role which brought him the most acclaim also became the source of his deepest burden. Lucas McCain was everything American audiences wanted in a father during the Cold War era. Dependable, brave, wise, and emotionally present. But Connors' real-life parenting often fell short of that ideal. He was married 3 times, and each relationship ended in estrangement. His first marriage to Elizabeth Jane Riddell bore 4 sons. To the public, they were the image of a happy family, but the reality was far more fractured. In a rare interview years after Connors' death, one of his sons reflected with heartbreaking candor. People ask me what it was like growing up with Lucas McCain as a father. I tell them I didn't. I grew up watching him on TV like everyone else. While Connors filmed scenes of fatherly devotion, his own children often spent birthdays without a phone call, milestones without his presence, and long stretches of time without any meaningful connection. Friends say he was consumed by fame and the pursuit of his next role, his next conquest. At home, he was often emotionally distant, if not physically absent. Even when he was present, he was described as distracted, lost in thoughts about scripts or conversations from the studio lot. Behind the charm, the emotional cost of stoicism. What made Chuck Connors so compelling on screen, his stoic strength, his quiet resolve, was also what made intimacy so difficult in his personal life. Those closest to him spoke of a man who rarely shared his emotions, who kept people at a distance, with a mix of charm and aloofness. Some colleagues found him magnetic and generous. Others found him moody and dismissive. Many described him as unpredictable. A fellow actor once remarked, "Chuck had a gift for making you feel like the only person in the room, until you realized he wasn't really listening." The praise he offered could turn to criticism without warning. He could draw you in with warmth, only to push you away moments later. It wasn't cruelty, necessarily. It was armor. Emotional defenses built over a lifetime of living in the public eye. As he aged and the spotlight began to dim, those defenses became more pronounced. He clung tightly to the image of Lucas McCain, even as the man behind the character grew more fragile. His interactions with younger women drew more scrutiny. His behavior, once dismissed as old-fashioned flirtation, began to seem increasingly out of touch. He was a man trapped in a role he had written for himself, unable or unwilling to let it go. The final curtain. Vulnerability at the end. In 1991, Chuck Connors returned to the role that had defined his career one final time. In the made-for-TV movie The Gambler Returns, The Luck of the Draw, he once again donned the iconic boots and rifle of Lucas McCain. But this time, something had changed. Those who were there during filming describe a moment that remains etched in memory. As Connors sorted through hats to find the one McCain would wear, he broke down in tears. It was a small but powerful gesture, one that spoke volumes. This wasn't just costuming. It was identity. McCain wasn't just a role he played. He was, in many ways, the man Connors wished he could fully become. But the emotional weight of that reunion came with a physical cost. Not long after, Connors was diagnosed with lung cancer, a consequence of years of heavy smoking. In early 1992, he was hospitalized with pneumonia. On November 10, 1992, he passed away at the age of 71.